They say trust is something natural, born with a lucky few. That's a lie. Unshakable confidence isn't a gift. It's a weapon forged in the silence of the mind and the cold calculation of reality. Machiavelli already knew. Those who trust too much in ideals end up being devoured by those who believe the end justifies the means. Have you ever noticed how most people only seem secure until the first sign of pressure? All it takes is one criticism, one disapproving look, and the whole castle crumbles. The secret lies elsewhere. Better to be feared than loved, but above all, never be seen as fragile. This dark art of trust isn't found in ready-made phrases, but in subtle gestures that shift others' perceptions without them even noticing. A pause at the right moment, a silence that weighs more than 1,000 words, a firm gaze that disarms any doubt. Politics guided by reality, not ideals. It's this territory few dare to enter because it requires discipline, courage, and above all, constant adaptability to never be caught off guard. What if I told you that confidence can be built like a loyal army within you? That it doesn't depend on luck or talent, but on reprogramming every detail of your presence until nothing and no one can shake your mind. This is the path you're about to discover, the dark art of unshakable confidence, the central premise. The central premise of all true power lies not in what is said in public, but in what is understood in silence. It's curious how people tend to believe the world operates based on lofty ideals, but the reality is always harsher. It is politics guided by reality, not ideals, that sustains those who truly govern. Machiavelli already warned that the end justifies the means, not because morality is disposable, but because human structures are always driven by interests and needs. Better to be feared than loved, he said, as long as one knows how to avoid being hated, because it is precisely in this fragile balance that stability is born. Consider any modern organization. Leaders who rely solely on charisma crumble when the storm arrives. Those who combine the appearance of virtue with a calculated use of force remain steadfast. And here comes virtue, the ability to shape fortune rather than wait for it to be kind. This premise is the starting point. There is no room for naivete, only for decisions based on true human nature. When one looks at history, one realizes that the empires that endured were not guided by sugar-coated speeches, but by loyal, dedicated armies, by solid structures that did not depend on favors from others. Rome did not build its legacy on vague promises, but on discipline, strategy, and constant adaptability in the face of the unexpected. And it is precisely this lesson that an individual can apply to their life, not waiting for good fortune to knock on the door, but forging their own path with clarity and calculation. In the job market, for example, those who understand true human nature know that talent is not enough. One must know how to demonstrate it at the right time with the appearance of virtue that opens doors. In other words, it's not about being fake, but about presenting oneself strategically, knowing when to smile and when to harden. It's the invisible game that few perceive, but everyone obeys. It is, in this context, that the real question arises. Who is willing to abandon illusions and face the fact that life is an arena, not a garden? Who accepts that sometimes the calculated use of force, whether a firm word in a meeting or an uncompromising decision in a negotiation, is what separates victory from defeat? The central premise, therefore, is not a distant theory, but a daily practice. And it begins within, when one realizes that being loved is pleasant, but being respected is indispensable. Machiavelli would say that blind trust in ideals is like building a castle on sand, while a cold reading of reality builds fortresses that stand for centuries. This understanding does not eliminate the human within us, but invites us to balance heart and calculation. And it is here that a dilemma arises. Within each of us, there is both an inner servant and an inner sovereign. And this silent struggle defines all destiny. Inner servant versus inner sovereign. Within each person, there is a constant struggle. On one side, the inner servant, who accepts life as it is. On the other, the inner sovereign, who decides to shape the world to his will. The servant is docile, prefers routine, takes no risks, and finds comfort in obedience. The sovereign, on the other hand, understands politics guided by reality, not ideals, and understands that life demands a stance. Machiavelli would say that the sovereign is the one who, faced with adversity, uses virtue to transform fortune, while the servant kneels waiting for luck. The sovereign acts with the logic that the end justifies the means, while the servant loses himself in moral excuses that prevent him from moving forward. A simple example. At work, the servant is the one who complains about the unfair boss but remains silent. The sovereign, in turn, devises strategies to gain influence, even if he must put on the appearance of virtue until the right moment to act. It's fascinating to note how this clash doesn't just happen in palaces or large corporations, but within the minds of ordinary people. The inner servant avoids being feared because he believes it generates rejection. The sovereign understands that it's often better to be feared than loved, as long as he knows how to avoid being hated. The servant worries about pleasing everyone. The sovereign seeks respect. The servant accepts living with borrowed armies, that is, depending on favors, luck, or the goodwill of others. The sovereign builds his own loyal armies and invests in his own independence, whether financial, emotional, or intellectual. While the servant shrinks from problems, the sovereign makes calculated use of force, knowing that firmness is not violence, but clarity. This difference in attitude completely transforms the way life responds. If we observe closely, we will see that society is structured to keep people in the role of servants. Schools teach obedience, companies train us to follow orders, and culture reinforces that being nice is virtue enough. But the inner sovereign breaks this pattern. It questions, creates, adapts, and doesn't wait for fortune to favor it. It provokes it. And this is the great shift that few have the courage to embrace. Choosing to leave the servant dormant and give voice to the sovereign requires discipline, courage, and above all, decisions based on true human nature. Machiavelli would call this constant adaptability, the ability to not cling to fixed formulas, but to reinvent oneself in the face of any scenario. And it is precisely in this act of inversion, when the servant gives way to the sovereign, that the principles that challenge the established order are born. Inversion principles. Life, in practice, is a game of reversals. Those who don't understand this end up being manipulated by those who have already realized that the world doesn't revolve around justice, but rather politics guided by reality, not ideals. Machiavelli made it clear that it's often necessary to reverse common logic. When everyone expects kindness, demonstrate firmness. When everyone believes in their own fragility, demonstrate strength. This is where the end justifies the means applies, because reversing roles isn't betraying principles, but using them strategically. Consider the example of historical leaders. Churchill, in the midst of war, didn't seek to please, but to terrify with the raw truth, blood, sweat, and tears. He understood that it was better to be feared than loved in that moment, because only then would he maintain the cohesion of an entire people. This principle of reversal is simple. When expectations are predictable, subverting the script creates impact. The curious thing is that inversion applies not only to politics or leadership, but to everyday life. In the workplace, when everyone tries to please the boss with praise, the one who dares to present a realistic vision without losing the appearance of virtue ends up gaining respect. When everyone complains in silence, The one who proposes solutions with a calculated use of force gains a foothold. This is the power of virtù, manipulating fortune without waiting for the current to flow, but rowing in the opposite direction when necessary. Inverting patterns is not gratuitous rebellion, but a conscious strategy. For example, if someone is always available to others, they come to be seen as a servant. But if they learn to set limits, perception transforms. Inversion is not just an external act, but a reconfiguration of one's own posture. The most interesting thing is that this art of inversion requires decisions based on real human nature. Everyone knows that predictability breeds boredom, and the unexpected provokes fascination or fear. This is precisely why those who master inversion build power. A simple silence instead of excuses can reverse the dynamics of a discussion. A firm look instead of an apology can alter the perception of authority. Constant adaptability comes into play here. It's not about always being tough, always soft, or always available, but about inverting at the exact moment to gain ground. Machiavelli, when analyzing princes and rulers, realized that inversion was the tool that separated those who reacted from those who commanded. And if inversion is a principle, the next step is to understand how trust is incorporated, not just as a feeling, but as an invisible weapon. Built-in trust. Confidence isn't a speech, it's a presence. It's not about repeating motivational phrases in front of the mirror, but about embodying an internal state that others perceive without you having to say a word. Machiavelli knew that true confidence is a policy guided by reality, not ideals. No one respects someone who sounds confident but trembles inside. That's why he championed the importance of the appearance of virtue, because others see posture first, intention second. Embodying confidence is walking with your head held high, your gaze firm, and your voice unwavering. It's as if you're saying without words, "I know what I'm doing." And here, virtue meets fortune. Those who master themselves seem blessed by luck, even when everything is calculated. Embodied confidence isn't a luxury, it's the foundation of survival in any arena. Consider a practical example. In a negotiation, two people have the same arguments and data. The difference lies in how they present themselves. One speaks hurriedly, gesticulates excessively, and tries to convince. The other remains calm, uses pauses, and demonstrates control. Which one conveys power? It's the latter, because trust depends not only on what is said, but on how it is said. It's the calculated use of force, not through aggression, but through silent firmness. Better to be feared than loved, said Machiavelli, but this is only sustained if trust is incorporated naturally, without apparent effort. This internal state can be trained. Deep breathing before entering a room, practicing erect posture, mastering the pause when speaking. These are small adjustments that build a presence that inspires respect. But there's a detail few realize. Confidence isn't about eliminating fear, it's about moving despite it. This is where the concept of decisions based on real human nature comes to life. Everyone feels insecure, even the most powerful. The difference is that some allow themselves to be paralyzed, while others stage a veneer of virtue until the inner feeling overtakes them. It's the old golden rule, fake it until you become it. And this pretense isn't falsehood, it's strategy, it's virtue in action to bend fortune in your favor. Embodied confidence is a daily exercise in constant adaptability because each environment demands a nuance. Sometimes silence, sometimes firmness, sometimes a calculated smile. And when this presence begins to become natural, the next challenge arises, reprogramming habits so that this posture isn't an occasional effort, but an unshakable routine. Reprogramming habits. Confidence only becomes unshakable when it stops being an effort and becomes a habit. And habit, as Machiavelli put it in other words, is a policy guided by reality, not by ideals. It's not enough to want to change. You need to reprogram every daily gesture. The person who waits for inspiration to act remains a slave to fortune. The one who consciously decides to create daily rituals masters their own virtue. Think of the individual who always lowers their voice when contradicted. They can practice responding slowly and firmly every day until their brain learns this new response. It's the calculated use of force applied to one's own body and mind. Is it better to be feared than loved? Yes, but first, one must train oneself not to love oneself less, not to sabotage oneself. Habits shape perceptions, and perceptions shape destinies. Reprogramming habits isn't just about rigid discipline, but about decisions based on true human nature. We know the mind loves shortcuts, and that's why habits work. If the inner servant acts on impulse, the inner sovereign creates habits that sustain it. Want to change your posture in public? Then, instead of just thinking about it, practice it daily. Walk into a room and take up space, even if no one is looking. Want more respect at work? Start speaking last in meetings, listening to everyone first, so your final word carries more weight. This is building your own loyal armies within yourself, practicing small gestures until they become reflexes. It's constant adaptability in the form of practice, not relying on luck, but programming your mind to respond strategically even in the heat of the moment. The most interesting thing is that habits, when reprogrammed, create a chain of automatic reversals. Someone who always apologized begins to use silence as a weapon. Someone who avoided conflict learns to face it with a firm gaze. It's not magic, it's a method. Machiavelli knew that the appearance of virtue isn't born by chance, but by repetition. The end justifies the means when the means is the daily practice that transforms a servant into a sovereign. The curious thing is that when reprogramming habits, not only our posture changes, but also the inner voice that guides us. The hesitant tone gives way to a firm command. And here we open space for the next lesson. Understanding how voice and silence can become tools as powerful as any speech. Voice and silence as tools. Few realize it, but voice and silence are political weapons as sharp as the sword. Machiavelli already intuited this when he said that the end justifies the means. Winning isn't always about speaking louder, but about choosing when to speak and when to remain silent. A firm, well-placed voice can break resistance. A well-used silence can do more damage than 1,000 speeches. It's politics guided by reality, not ideals, because human beings respond not only to content, but to the impact of presence. Consider a simple example. In a meeting, while everyone speaks at the same time, trying to prove a point, the one who remains silent, observing, already begins to gain an aura of control. And when they finally open their mouth, each word carries weight as if it were law. It's the calculated use of force in its most subtle form. There's an art to the cadence of speech. Those who understand that it's better to be feared than loved know that their voice shouldn't always sound sweet, but firm, without hesitation. And at the same time, they must avoid being hated, balancing their tone with the appearance of virtue, not shouting, not humiliating, but making themselves heard. This is something that requires practice. A political speaker, for example, knows that a 3-second pause before a key phrase captures more attention than a rushed speech. The same is true in ordinary conversations. Silence can invert the logic of power because it creates discomfort and anticipation. The virtue here lies in controlling the pace, not letting the fortune of the moment decide how you react. Talking too much exposes yourself. Remaining silent at the right moment creates mystery and respect. The curious thing is that both voice and silence obey the same rule: decisions based on true human nature. Humans fear emptiness, and so silence disconcerts them. Humans respect firm sound, and so the voice guides them. Those who master these two tools possess their own loyal armies in the field of communication. It doesn't depend on shouting or excessive explanations, but on calculated balance. Constant adaptability appears once again, knowing when silence is power and when the voice is necessary to seal authority. Machiavelli would show that force, when not physical, must be symbolic, and nothing is more symbolic than a word well spoken at the right moment, or a silence that echoes louder than any speech. And it is precisely here that the next step arises. Achieving vocal mastery, the ability to transform every word into a sword and every pause into a shield. Vocal mastery. The voice is the channel through which authority manifests itself. Machiavelli, when analyzing princes and rulers, knew that power lay not only in what was said, but in how it was said. Vocal mastery arises precisely from this awareness, speaking not to fill the silence, but to shape perceptions. Those who master their voice understand that politics guided by reality, not ideals, requires tone, cadence, and intention. A firmly spoken sentence can end a debate, while the same sentence, mumbled, is lost in the air. Better to be feared than loved, but this feeling arises not from content, but from form. The appearance of virtue also manifests itself in the voice, confident, calm, unhurried, conveying the idea that the speaker knows exactly where they are leading. The voice is a sovereign's first troop, and it must sound like its own loyal armies. Vocal mastery, however, is not a gift. It's practice. It's the calculated use of force converted into sound. Orators like Martin Luther King Jr. or Churchill weren't born ready. They studied intonation, pauses, and rhythm. A simple pause before a key word can be the difference between being ignored and being remembered for centuries. This is the game of virtu and fortuna, appearing natural when, in fact, every detail has been rehearsed. And anyone can apply this. Want to train your voice? Read aloud books that require force of expression, like classic speeches or even Machiavelli's The Prince. Record yourself, listen, and notice where your voice wavers and where it conveys power. Training your voice is like reprogramming habits. The more you practice, the more your body learns to incorporate authority as a natural state. Interestingly, vocal mastery isn't limited to public speaking. It applies to everyday conversations, job interviews, negotiations, and even personal discussions. Decisions based on real human nature show us that people judge more by sound than by meaning. A request made in a wavering voice sounds like a plea. The same request made in a firm voice sounds like an order. And this is where constant adaptability reveals itself. The ability to vary the tone according to the situation, sometimes sweet to persuade, sometimes deep to intimidate, sometimes neutral to create mystery. Machiavelli would say that the voice, when used well, is an invisible army capable of conquering territory in the minds of others. But for the voice to be invincible, it is also necessary to strengthen the mind, to make it emotionally unattainable, so that no external pressure can disarm the constructed posture. Emotionally unattainable mind. An emotionally untouchable mind is a sovereign's true fortress. It sustains embodied confidence, vocal mastery, and the calculated use of force. Machiavelli already understood that one does not govern by the exposed heart, but by reason, which knows how to handle storms. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, means accepting that emotions exist, but cannot control decisions. The inner servant reacts to insult with anger. The inner sovereign observes, evaluates, and decides the response that best serves its purpose. It is the practical application of the idea that the end justifies the means. It doesn't matter what you feel. What matters is what you do with it. Imagine a leader who loses control in public. He opens up breaches. One who maintains a serene countenance, even amidst chaos, becomes a beacon of strength. Training this unattainability isn't about denying emotions, but using them to your advantage. Better to be feared than loved, yes, but that only works if anger or anxiety don't manifest in a destructive way. The secret is to avoid being hated, and this is achieved by filtering emotions before expressing them. It's self-mastery that guarantees the appearance of virtue. Want some practical examples? When you feel irritated, take 3 deep breaths before responding. When you feel fear, ask yourself, what can I gain by acting despite it? This is how you build your own loyal armies in your mind, by transforming emotions into advisors, not tyrants. Virtue here lies in manipulating your emotional fortune, adapting to circumstances without losing your center. The most fascinating thing is that an unattainable mind doesn't mean absolute coldness, but rather balance. Decisions based on true human nature show that everyone is influenced by emotions. The difference is who governs and who is governed by them. This skill generates automatic respect. People feel safe around those who don't waver in the face of crises. It's constant adaptability applied to emotions. Those who master this realize that arguments cease to be traps, attacks cease to be threats, and compliments cease to be golden chains. Everything becomes information, not prison. And when someone reaches this state, one truth becomes clear. Depending on others to validate your worth is weakness, and it is precisely at this turning point that the next principle is born. The notion that dependence is the greatest form of servitude. Dependence is weakness. Dependence is the invisible shackle that turns sovereigns into servants. Machiavelli warned that borrowed armies never defend a kingdom with the same loyalty as one's own soldiers, and the same is true of life. Depending on the approval of others is to place one's own fate in their hands. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, means understanding that whoever controls your needs controls you. The inner servant lives in search of approval, while the inner sovereign builds autonomy. Better to be feared than loved, but nothing is worse than being ignored because your voice lacks its own weight. The end justifies the means when the means is independence, financial, emotional, or intellectual. The dependent are manipulated by praise or the threat of loss. The independent make decisions based on their goals, not the whims of others. Dependence appears in many subtle forms. The employee who doesn't dare contradict the boss for fear of being fired, the partner who sacrifices himself to avoid losing the relationship, the entrepreneur who lives waiting for a lucky break. In all these cases, there are no loyal armies of his own, but rather a disguised submission. The calculated use of force here lies in cutting invisible cords. Want practical examples? If the dependence is financial, create an emergency fund that gives you the freedom to refuse humiliation. If it's emotional, practice being alone, cultivating hobbies that don't depend on anyone. If it's intellectual, read and study until you're no longer hostage to other people's opinions. Virtue lies in shaping your fortune, building solid foundations that make each decision less vulnerable to external blackmail. Avoiding being hated is wise advice, but being dependent is worse. It's being used. An emotionally unattainable mind is complete when it cuts the chains of excessive need. This doesn't mean isolating yourself, but creating real choices. Decisions based on true human nature show that those with options wield power, and those without live as servants. Constant adaptability manifests when you can move between relationships without clinging to any out of necessity. Machiavelli would say that the sovereign doesn't beg for favors, he distributes opportunities strategically, and herein lies the true key. To break dependence, one must reconfigure in practice one's way of life. It's not just about theory, but about creating structures that sustain freedom. And that's precisely what the next step reveals, the practical reconfiguration of one's entire life. practical reconfiguration, all theory is lost if not applied. Machiavelli didn't write to adorn libraries, but to give the prince a survival manual amidst chaos. And this is the essence of practical reconfiguration, transforming principles into concrete action. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, requires each person to view their life as a territory to be governed. Where are your strengths? Where are the gaps? The end justifies the means when the means is the discipline that strengthens your weaknesses and expands your strengths. Reconfiguring is like redrawing a map. If before you lived as a servant of circumstances, now you must build internal walls, train your own loyal armies, and assume the role of sovereign. This doesn't happen overnight, but with every choice, every corrected habit, every masterfully spoken word. In practice, reconfiguring means acting with calculated force in key areas. Want to earn respect at work? Set clear boundaries. Learn to say no without hesitation and use your voice firmly. Want financial independence? Study investments, diversify your income, and stop waiting for fortune to knock on your door. Be the architect of your own luck. Want to expand your confidence? Expose yourself to uncomfortable situations deliberately until your mind becomes emotionally untouchable. Virtue isn't theory, it's constant practice. Better to be feared than loved, but above all, better to be respected because your very presence already communicates power. This reconfiguring requires discipline, but it rewards freedom. After all, decisions based on real human nature always trump illusions dressed up with empty promises. The bottom line is that reconfiguring life isn't just about changing habits, but about changing structures. The inner sovereign reorganizes everything: time, energy, relationships. It avoids being hated, but never allows itself to be used. It transforms dependence into autonomy, weakness into strategy, silence into a weapon. Constant adaptability ensures that even when fortune turns against it, virtue keeps it standing. This practice is what separates those who merely read about power from those who truly wield it. And here's the final detail: practical reconfiguration doesn't end the process, it merely opens the door. Because if you've made it this far, you've already realized that unshakable confidence isn't a gift, but a dark art, honed step by step. And it's precisely this art that the introduction to our journey needs to address. Now that you've gone through each principle, only one question remains. What will you do with it? Will you let your inner servant continue to rule, begging for approval and relying on luck? Or will you summon your inner sovereign to reign over your own life? Machiavelli would say that politics guided by reality, not ideals, demands action. So what habits do you need to reprogram today? What silence do you need to weaponize? What dependency do you need to cut to be free? The end justifies the means when the means is your transformation. And remember, it's better to be feared than loved, as long as you know how to avoid being hated. This unshakable confidence won't be built in a single day, but each step you take places you among the select group of those who refuse to bow to chaos. Are you willing to walk this path, or will you remain where you are, waiting for fortune to smile on you by chance? If this journey has awakened you, it's time to act. Write in the comments what resonated most with you. Your answer could be the first building block of this inner fortress. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue learning about the invisible weapons that shape human power. Because unshakable confidence isn't a privilege, it's a choice.